Now, the question about the size of industrial enterprises brings up a related point about technology. It is often said that distributists are Luddites. I think Professor Varacalli said he was a Luddite before, but not all distributists are. And it's thought that we're opposed to anything more complicated than hammers and saws, and that distributism would hinder technological development. This is not the case. Different attitudes toward technology exist among distributists, and the question of what level of technology is appropriate for mankind, although I think it's a very important question that needs to be debated and discussed, is a separate question from the proper distribution of property. Distributism is perfectly compatible with many different levels and kinds of technology. And I might just add, Professor Novak, that the reason that mankind is able to create is because of our God-given intelligence. This was not something that came into existence in the 18th century, as if somehow before that the human mind had been sort of lying dormant. But that God put that there in the beginning. Now, one very important aspect of a distributed economy, again in accordance with papal teaching, especially of Popes Leo XIII, Pius XI, and Pius XII, is that these individual firms, these individual workshops and farms that distributists would hope to bring about, would be organized into occupational groups, or to give them their older and more familiar name, guilds. Occupational groups are autonomous societies consisting of all who produce the same product or provide the same service. Their purpose is the necessary regulation of the industry in question with the twin aim of its honest prosperity and the provision to the public of a quality product or service. They would concern themselves with matters such as product quality, technological research, safety standards, prices, training programs, compensation for trainees, supply of raw materials, and the like, and would represent the industry or trade in dealings with the government. On the local level, an occupational group might purchase for common use an expensive piece of machinery which no single owner could afford. And note, and this is a very important point of distributism, note that very much of the economic and industrial regulation which the modern state undertakes would, under distributism, be exercised by these lower bodies. Occupational groups would not be agencies of the government, neither would they be voluntary organizations. They are true intermediate groups and have both private and public aspects. Membership in them would be required for all who exercise a trade or profession. Their governance, like that of the medieval guilds, would be democratic. In cases where an occupational group has started to act like a cartel and to ignore the common good, the public authorities would be empowered to step in to prevent or end the abuse in question. The nearest analog in our own present society would perhaps be a bar association, whose membership in some states is mandatory for attorneys and which regulates some aspects of legal education, admission to the bar, and professional discipline. These occupational groups or guilds would in fact free the government from many tasks which it now undertakes, but which it is not especially well suited to perform. Whenever possible, the regulation of the workplace and the economy should be done by not be done by the central government, but by smaller and lower bodies in accordance with the principle of subsidiarity articulated by Pius XI. These occupational groups will also aid in spreading the spirit of solidarity or social charity among those engaged in the same line of work, so that instead of regarding each other as competitors, they will tend to see each other as engaged in a joint task to provide the public with a needed good or service. At the same time, of course, receiving a sufficient remuneration to provide decently for themselves and their families. And this is a very important point of any kind of economic thought which attempts to grace itself on Catholic social teaching, namely that there is a need, the public has a need, let's say, for food. Certain people undertake to supply that need. Instead of seeing themselves as rivals, as competitors, as people trying to drive each other out of business or always get a larger share of the market, why can't they see each other simply as we are brothers, we are trying to fulfill a joint task for the public. Of course, we need to receive in return a sufficient income for our families, but we're basically trying to perform a service. Now, the establishment of a distributed economy would necessarily take place gradually. Right now, even right now, there is much that we can do on our own, including, for example, patronizing as much as possible local markets and small stores, the use of local currencies, establishing cooperatives, and the like. Chesterton and Belloc saw favorable tax treatment for small firms or for transactions in which property becomes more widely distributed as important means for the legal establishment of distributism. But right now, it is to our own collective and individual actions that we must chiefly look. As I said, distributists do not desire any equality of incomes or heavy-handed regulation by the state. Distributism is an effort to provide an institutional framework in which our use of external goods would not conflict with our pursuit of holiness. At the heart of distributism is the attempt to place man's activities in a right relationship with God, insofar as human institutions can do that. Distributists realize that grace perfects nature, as St. Thomas taught, and that only if human institutions have a basic orientation toward justice and right can we expect divine grace to be fruitful in human society. I must say a word now about the other two economic systems represented here today, capitalism and socialism. If we are to talk intelligently about either of them, we must be clear what we mean. Otherwise, we may be talking at cross purposes. As for capitalism, despite its ubiquity in the modern world, there is surprising little consensus among economists and economic historians as to exactly what it is. I will use the definition of Pope Pius XI in the encyclical, which I have more than once quoted today, Quadragesimo Anno. And Pope Pius calls it, quote, that economic system in which were provided by different people the capital and labor jointly needed for production, unquote. In other words, the widespread separation of ownership from work, the general presence of the employer-employee relationship, which I have been criticizing today, this is capitalism, since, quote, different people provide the capital and labor jointly needed for production. I have already said why distributists think that capitalism is dangerous and unwise. All the ills of capitalism, what is sometimes called the spirit of capitalism, such as its excessive concentration upon amassing riches, the loss of genuine quality in production, the periodic instability of capitalist economies with their irregular cycles of boom and bust, their tendency toward labor conflicts, all these are simply the more or less necessary results of that original separation between capital and labor, between ownership and work. It's often assumed that capitalism is simply the system of private ownership of property. We have seen that this is not the case. Capitalism, in fact, has entirely forgotten the reason private property exists, and in reality is no friend of property. Above, I quoted St. Thomas to the effect that the appetite of natural riches is not infinite, because according to a set measure, they satisfy nature. That is, natural goods have a purpose and end and should be judged on how well they fulfill that end. Under distributism, the purpose of private property is clear: the support of the producer and his family, the provision of a quality product to the society. But capitalism has divorced property from its natural purpose. The mere amassing of property beyond any rational need cannot be the reason why God gave man the use of material goods. G.K. Chesterton once wittily wrote, "One would think, to hear people talk, that the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers were on the side of property. But obviously they are the enemies of property, because they're the enemies of their own limitations. They do not want their own land, but other people's. It is a negation of property that the Duke of Sutherland should have all the farms in one estate, just as it would be the negation of marriage if he had all our wives in one harem." Again, just like marriage having a purpose and being limited and controlled by that purpose, similarly, property has a purpose and must be limited and controlled by that purpose. And just as we don't shrink from establishing laws to regulate marriage, we shouldn't think that establishing laws to orient property toward this end is somehow antithetical to the Catholic tradition. Under capitalism, property is considered valuable only because of its exchange value. There is no essential legal difference between your property in a farm or a home handed down in your family for 5 generations and your property in a share of a hedge fund. Both are equally sacred to the law, only because both are equally capable of monetary exchange, of being bought and sold. Pope Leo XIII gave the classic Catholic justification for private property in Rerum Novarum, and he wrote, "Men always work harder and more readily when they work on that which is their own. Nay, they learn to love the very soil which yields in response to the labor of their hands, not only food to eat, but an abundance of the good things for themselves and those that are dear to them." Now, this is the Church's defense of private property, a defense based on the intimate connection of person and property. But under capitalism, property is anything from which I can make a buck.